My name's Ruth Stewart, and I'm the Director of the Africa Centre for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg. I've been asked to just outline a couple of rules of engagement for our session this afternoon. So participants, you'll see that your microphones and your cameras are off. Whilst it's really exciting to be able to engage with you face-to-face with large numbers of attendees, your opportunity to contribute today is through the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm sorry to those of you who weren't able to join us live, who aren't able to join us live, but we are recording this session and we will be making it available afterwards. So thank you for joining us, whether it's live or indirectly. As part of my work as Director of the Africa Centre for Evidence, I lead a team who are specialists in systematic aggregation of the evidence. We work really closely to support people to use evidence in decision-making, and we do that through, we try to make a difference to poverty and inequality through building strong relationships and through sharing capacities with decision-makers, particularly decision-makers who are working to use evidence in their decisions, and ensuring that our work is always underpinned by the best available evidence. I'm particularly proud of a long-lasting relationship that we've had at ACE with the Department for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in the South African government, as well as with a number of other departments and units across government. Our role in this relationship hasn't been to tell our government colleagues what our research evidence says, or even to advocate on behalf of other academics about what their research finds, but to share what we know about how to search for, screen for relevance, code for particular pieces of information, and collate and synthesize that evidence into evidence maps and systematic reviews, so that together with our government colleagues, we can help to shape policy and ensure that it's informed by the best available evidence. So today our colleagues are launching their guidance for evidence management in policy development. And we're really proud that ACE has played a role in this really exciting development. Before I hand over to my co-chair to introduce himself and his work in the Department for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, I just want to acknowledge that we've had a number of funding sources that have supported us as a centre in this work, including in this session. It originally started with funding from the Department for International Development many years ago from the UK, and more recently from IDRC and the Hewlett Foundation as part of a programme called PEERS, the Partnership for Evidence and Equity in Responsive Social Systems. I'm pleased now to introduce my co-chair, Mr. Godfrey Mashamba, who is the Deputy Director General in DPME. He is responsible for evaluation, evidence and knowledge systems in the department, and has previously served as Chief Director in the Department for Science and Technology, and with various other portfolios with the Department for Trade and Industry. Godfrey holds a number of degrees and has co-authored work around the indicator for research and development in South Africa. He's also been part of drafting various policy documents, including our 2018 white paper on science and technology and innovation and the National Industrial Policy Framework. And he's been an active supporter in the work that's going to be presented today about what we refer to as the SEIAS system. So Godfrey, over to you to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Stewart. We from the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation welcome this opportunity to engage with you and the community of practice in this way. Obviously, we are happy to see that there is a launching of the guideline that will help in the use of evidence in policy as an extension of the great work that has been done for so many years in this area. From the department side, the kind of work that your center does, the Africa Center for Evidence does, we think is important. And then it's an area of capability that needs to be deepened within the DPME as the government that operates at the center of government. We also think that it should be expanded in various policy domains, because aggregation of evidence is actually very important, so that we are able to see a particular or assess particular issues from various dimensions and see the totality of the, the effect of it. But also think that it's important to network and exchange knowledge in this area, both locally, build a serious community of practice in this area, locally and also internationally, so that we can actually make this a way of working. So from the department side, given the role to coordinate planning across government and also to monitor performance of key government programs and to evaluate the various policies, programs, and processes in government to make improvement. The work that's being presented today, we think that is a great contribution to a tools of analysis or tools of practice that we should apply to realize the development and impact of government. So it's actually very important that public officials should actually be sensitized about its application. So the system of socio-economic impact assessment has been around government for quite a while. It even predates the regulatory impact assessment that was run by the National Treasury. It so happens that when these frameworks are developed, they help to formalize the practice, to make it more systematic. But the use of evidence or assessment of the implication of what a potential a change in policy or introduction of a new policy would be, it's something that should just happen as a matter of as something that's so ordinary that need to just happen as we are involved in policy processes. So we are very grateful to be part of this session. I think Ms. Pulane Kole, who's going to speak next, she's got a whole lot of detail, given that she has been working on this socio-economic impact assessment framework, both at the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation and going to the Presidency's Policy Research Services. She'll give us a whole lot more detail around the new development in this space. So I'm doing that in order to introduce her. Ms. Pulane Kole is a Chief Policy Analyst within the Presidency's Policy Research Services. Her responsibilities include supporting government departments in applying the SEIAS framework. She also coordinates the strategic research projects and support government departments on their public policy development process. She was previously with the DPME, as I said, as a specialist responsible for coordination, monitoring, and implementation of foresight indicators and the assessment of management practice in the public service, something that's we commonly known as good governance and accountability key performance area in the language of the department. Before that, she used to be with the Mpumalanga province, the Office of the Premier, leading macro policy development there. She's got qualifications in natural sciences, business administration, leadership and development. And I've noted that she's also in the final year of her master's in town and regional planning at the University of Pretoria. Over to you, Ms. Kole.
Good afternoon, and to you, chairs of this exciting session. Thank you for the opportunity and the preparations for us to have this event. And Professor Ruth and your team, as well as DPME, I'm going to do a presentation on the SEIAS, also sharing the journey of this system and some of the experiences. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, we can see the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you. So the presentation will cover understanding of what SEIAS is, how it was introduced in government, its application, institutional arrangements for implementation, key principles when applying SEIAS, and some of the support initiatives in conclusion. So Socio-Economic Impact Assessment System, or SEIAS, is an ex-ante policy analysis tool aimed to strengthen policy and lawmaking in government. It is thought-provoking, so it's not a compliance to get a certificate and do submissions for approval. It's an interactive kind of a tool that allows various stakeholders to interact in strengthening policies and legislation making. It is also independent in a way that it questions certain aspects of policy making and multidimensional in a way that during policy making, we have to consider the vulnerable, we have to consider challenges of poverty, inequality, unemployment, the economy, issues of sustainable environment, and how do we become competitive as a country. And it also takes into consideration issues of governance as well as state capacity. And it has to be applied through policy making. So it doesn't happen at the end when a policy or a bill is being finalized. It's a tool to assist decision making. We know as management leadership, we have to make decisions on day-to-day to deal with opportunities or threats. In private sector also is to say, how do we survive as a company? How do we make profit? How do we thrive, and rise above all external forces that we are confronted with? So it's about choosing a different pathway to effectively address emerging challenges and opportunities. And therefore, evidence becomes very important so that we are making informed decisions. So we have to understand that regulation have impacts that can negatively or positively impact the society. So for example, there are some laws that big businesses are able to adjust and implement, but negatively impact SMMEs. So we have to be considerate of that when we develop laws. So for example, laws that relates to business licensing, issues of zoning, you find that our SMMEs in townships are unable to comply with the requirements that are being imposed on them, like your building legislation or and issues around licensing, whether you have title deeds, whether can you zone your property, your residential property to be used for business. So those are some of the things that we have to consider: the rich versus the poor, rural versus urban. And some of our laws actually perpetuate exclusion of the vulnerable into the active participation in the economy. So through SEIAS, departments analyze broader socioeconomic challenges, associated costs and risks, and have to upfront develop mitigation actions so that you don't have surprises during implementation, but in the main to also ensure that our policy proposals are aligned to the National Development Plan, but by taking into consideration how our policies will impact and relate to transformation and inclusive economic growth. So in terms of the journey of regulatory impact assessment into the tool that is adopted by South Africa, which is called the Socio-Economic Impact Assessment. So the issues of impact assessment started, for example, at the time around 1978 in the US under the leadership of Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, where there were challenges of rising inflation and unemployment, and also the currency losing value. And they introduced an inflation impact assessment. And one of the issues was to look into the federal regulation that was impacting private businesses. And also at the time of Ronald Reagan, the Republicans also came up with a cost-benefit analysis, and some of the issues where the president actually signed an executive order and looking into reducing the burden that the federal government was imposing to the economy in terms of their regulation, and to provide that to the extent that law permits, a regulatory action shall not be undertaken unless the potential benefits to the society from that regulation outweighs the potential cost to the society. So those were early articulation on impact assessment, and also the regulation that the negative impacts that the regulation had on businesses and delivery of services. So in the 1985-86, Australian government also introduced or implemented the regulatory impact assessment, which then moved to OECD countries. By 2000, about 20 of the OECD countries already started implementing the regulatory impact assessment, or RIA. So in South Africa, around 2007, Cabinet introduced RIA as a tool for better regulation. And there were discussions around, we are a concern that we are having pro-poor policies, but we still have challenges of poverty, unemployment, and the economy that is not inclusive. And the Cabinet at that time approved that the RIA be piloted for 2 years, meaning from 2007 to 2009. So it meant that Cabinet was going to use the CAP memos and RIA reports to guide decisions on better regulation. So there were also institutional arrangements that were put into place around the implementation of the pilot. So the former Policy Coordination and Advisory Services, PICAS, and Cabinet Office were to enforce and advocate for better regulation. National Treasury was responsible for providing capacity to departments and ensuring financial resources for RIA and the consultations. And departments were responsible for conducting RIA for legislation that they were initiating. So in terms of the outcomes of the pilot, very few RIAs were undertaken. So RIA was not properly institutionalized in departments' policy-making processes. And also it narrowly focused on likely economic costs and benefits to business needs, not taking into account on broader national priorities. So when the 2-year pilot expired in 2009, it was not renewed, and there were changes also around the administration at that time, where PICAS was replaced by the DPME. So in 2014, SEIAS was then introduced in government by DPME in partnership with the former Economic Development Department, National Treasury, and TIPS. And Rudy Dix, who is also in our midst, was leading this process. Then Cabinet approved SEIAS in 2015, also establishing a SEIAS unit within DPME. And in September, Cabinet gave effect on implementation of SEIAS, that it has to be applied to all public policies, bills, and regulations with official implementation date of October 2016. With the President's Coordinating Council, it was also then approved to be rolled out to provinces and municipalities. So the unit and partners created awareness in government and external stakeholders around this SEIAS. And we also facilitated departmental induction on its application. And just to demonstrate the institutionalization of SEIAS, so from June 2015 to 31st March, we had about 608 policy proposals that were subjected to SEIAS, of which 79% were bills, policies, and regulations. Currently, in the current administration, the President emphasized that public policies have to be evidence-based and effectively coordinated, and he's a leader on implementation of structural economic reforms. Remember, colleagues, he also engaged departments like water and sanitation around reducing the turnaround time to issue water licenses, looking at the e-visa reforms. And Rudy Dix, who's also in our midst, is leading this exciting work on implementation of structural economic reforms around telecommunications, water, energy sector, and transport. And then 2020, after the establishment of the policy and research services in the presidency, the SEIAS unit was then transferred through the National Macro Organization of Government. So on the application of SEIAS, it actually follows two phases, namely the initial impact assessment and final impact assessment. So the initial impact assessment is linked to research and better understanding of the socio-economic problems or opportunities that requires government attention and allows decision makers to look for or to evaluate alternative options to address identified problems. So evidence is very critical in this process to assist in understanding the socioeconomic problems, but also in coming up with solutions that will be able to address those problems. So it has to happen at early stages of the drafting of the green paper or concept documents. And they have to also engage policy and research services in terms of the analysis and providing the independent feedback on that process. And the other phase deals with the option that has been identified during the initial impact assessment. So it's more detailed on a policy or legislation that have been decided as an option. It identified mechanism for monitoring, evaluation, and modification, and also how to manage appeals, particularly where you have highly contested policy proposals, and to say how do we manage without having to deal with litigations in courts. But the important part also is the monitoring aspect on clearly defining how a particular policy will be monitored and followed through to see whether it will have an impact on the economy as well as the society. And there are various processes that happens around the submissions with PRS and different form of certification. There are also exclusions of applying SEIAS. So it's mostly around the automatic increases in statutory fees, like also for your money bills, like your division of revenue, and also for corporate related policies. But we encourage that when departments are coming up with policies, they have to integrate with corporate policies in terms of resources that will be required for implementation of those policies. With regard to institutional arrangements for implementing SEIAS, it actually requires capable and accountable institutions that will use evidence to inform policies and be ethical in terms of the evidence used, so that you don't manipulate evidence to support a particular ideology. So it requires also that institutions have to be accountable. So it's not about ticking boxes that a particular policy or bill has been finalized, but it has to be followed through for implementation, and it requires engagement, working together with our social partners, and better resource allocations and innovations around implementation. So officials who are responsible for developing policies or laws are the ones who apply SEIAS, but there has to be an independent review that is done through engagement with other departments, through also policy and research services, and using subject experts to support departments. So we also have SEIAS champions in departments who are ensuring that SEIAS is applied in various units within departments, and we are responsible, as well as offices of the Premier, to coordinate and capacitate departments, but also doing quality assurance. And then Cabinet Office ensures that all submissions that goes to Cabinet for policies and bills have quality assured SEIAS reports. The next slide is on key principles of when applying SEIAS. We have to understand the context of our country and the history, and to also bear in mind of the vulnerable. So we're talking women, youth, children, persons with disabilities, and to say how will our regulation or policies that we are introducing going to change the lives of our people. We have to also think about, so for example, women, we have high population of women compared to male counterparts, and most of them are female. They are heading households, particularly in large areas of large rural areas in this country. We have to consider the challenges of gender-based violence and femicide when we regulate. We have to think about those who are unemployed, who have to travel long distances and do not have enough for public transport to look for job opportunities. We have to think also about the representation of women in senior positions who are also heading households. And so those are some of the dynamics that we have to consider when we develop our policies. The spatial inequalities, like for example, if you look at the issues of digital society, we still have the inequalities in terms of urban metros and rural areas, where we have very few households who have access to internet services, so it means they are being excluded in terms of also receiving your e-government services and other services that, or other opportunities that comes with technology. We have to also consider the national priorities to say to what extent our regulation actually enhancing or advancing the implementation of the national priorities, but also in terms of trade-offs that we are making. And also to think through whether do we really need to come up with a new regulation or improve on what is existing. And we have to utilize SEIAS throughout policy making, the use of credible evidence for research and option analysis. It's quite critical. and to consider the current challenges of COVID and also global trends. What are we learning from the pandemic in our processes? It is very important that we also engage other departments and organs of state in early stages of research to ensure that we don't come up with policies that contradict each other, because when they contradict each other, it becomes a burden for those who have to conform. It becomes a burden for the public, our businesses, because of the fragmentation that is happening internally. So we have to also need to conceptualize through discussion documents and policies. So we have challenges where other departments go straight into coming up with legislation without having to go through the green paper and white paper processes. So policies and laws have to be resourced, and we have to prioritize and bring innovation so that we are able to support the implementation. The implementation plans, monitoring and evaluation are very critical in policy making and to determine whether we have good policies or not. So we cannot say as a country we have good policies, but implementation is a problem. Implementation has to be thought through during the drafting of our policies, and we have to monitor so that we can swiftly intervene. So it doesn't have to take us 10 years to realize that a particular policy is not achieving its objective. And we have to be bold where a policy or a program is not adding value and taking resources, limited resources that we have to be bold to terminate it. And we have to measure what is working well so that there are also continuous improvement. Yesterday's improvement might not be relevant in today's environment, and have to coherently achieve implementation of a national priority. So we have to work, collaborate and work with our social partners in achieving the national priorities. The last slide from my side is around the initiatives that we are having to support government. So we have finalized a SEIAS curriculum with National School of Government to offer trainings, and it will be soon be launched, and trainings will commence in August. And we have various community of practices to support departments on a range of issues, such as quantification of policies, how to come up with theory of change, the log frame, and proper implementation plan for policies and legislation. We have also the National Framework for Policy Development to guide departments on policy making. The framework was approved by Cabinet last year, December, and we are in the phase of creating awareness as well as implementing its aspects. So DPME came up with evidence mapping and guidelines, which we are also launching today. And we have various evaluations that has been conducted that helps as part of evidence for policy making. And we have also policy analysis experts within DPME that assist us during the analysis of policies. A public policy development and research network has been established last year, where that comprise of national, provincial government and academia to strengthen our research capacity within government, but also to ensure that we are able to share evidence without having to start a new research project. And we are also involved in a process of initiating the repeal of obsolete legislation, which will require use of evidence, but also streamlining some of the legislation so that there is effective delivery of services. And we are currently also working on another research project to improve the turnaround time to finalize bills. So currently it takes on average about 5 years to finalize legislation. So it means then the problem that needs to be solved through that particular regulation will remain for 5 years. And also ministers who have initiated those legislation would have been moved to other departments or will no longer be in that particular portfolio. So it also creates issues of uncertainty for those who have to adapt and conform to those kind of initiatives. So that's basically the presentation on socio-economic impact assessment. Thank you, coaches.
Thank you very much. What an informative input, Pulana, on the explanation of the SEIAS. I acknowledge the comments that are coming through on the chat box. We're going to have time to respond to them later in the meeting. I also want to share with you, Pulane, that I was chairing another workshop earlier on, and a question was asked on whether SEIAS process was followed when the regulations under COVID-19 were being introduced. So I looked around and I found that you were not there. I said, no. Anyway, I'm going to have a discussion with you later in the day. If you have time, you can clarify that issue. Colleagues, our society is so diverse. Any new policy or change in policy that can be introduced will affect different segments of our society differently, also at different times. I think that's a message that you can get from the presentation. So it is also important that this tool of SEIAS, when it is applied, it should be applied correctly so that we end up with well-informed decisions and also better outcomes. I think the next presentation will take us there, where Harsha is going to give, Harsha Dayal is going to give an overview of SEIAS Evidence Management Guide. Harsha is with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. She's a director responsible for research and knowledge management function. She has been with the DPME since 2012. And then one of her first assignments at the DPME was the 20-year review project for the presidency. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Johannesburg. Among her qualifications is a master's degree in public health and a BSc in occupational therapist. She said by profession, she practiced as occupational therapist since between 1993 and 2007. Before she joined the Human Sciences Research Council. And then she's involved in various advisory and technical reference groups in an area of work. Harsha, over to you for the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Godfrey. And really appreciate that people and colleagues and friends have put this time aside for joining us on this launch. So Pulane has given us this rich, deep processes behind the SEIAS, actually from the entire time the SEIAS has been in its making. And I thought today I just wanted to concentrate on the supportive function that we play in DPME from the Research and Knowledge Management Unit. So I am going to just, let me see if I can move the slides. Is it moving on your side? Okay.
Yes, it is moving.
Yes. So I thought, let me take a moment up front to give you a reflection, whereas, we often take the reflection towards the end on how this guide actually came about. And, there was really the 3 C's for me in terms of the champions, where there was foresight and deep commitment with these efforts from the very people that are on this panel in having had this kind of focus that we are talking about. So from academia, from government, and from civil society. So in terms of just the connections that we're putting together is from different streams of work and really connecting the silos. When I mean by silos is that when SEIAS was being launched and developed as Pulane and Rudy were undertaking it, we on the other side from the evidence branch was also launching a new approach to how government engages with evidence. And then we have all the content experts. So DPMA has a lot of content experts together with departmental content experts. And I think this is what we wanted to hear from the respondents themselves, because people like Nonhlanhla and others that we are engaging with are the sector experts within government. So basically this was a bringing together of the ideas that actually are connected. And as Godfrey had said, in the midst of a pandemic, and certainly with much engagements and discussions over the past few weeks by DPME and other partners on the COVID-19 country report, we note that implementation and operational capacity, especially for regulatory interventions and its assessment thereof, will always be put to a test. So the SEIAS and the evidence guide is on the long haul. It's not under urgency and emergency situations, but in ways that it's a long view to be able to improve the policy space, because we still recognize persistent challenges across the sectors. So just a quick and the easy part is to navigate you through the guide, and the guide is available on DPME as well as ACE websites. That it's actually in two parts. The first part is to give you the concept and purpose of SEIAS just as much as the depth that Pulani has given us, but from our side, it's from the perspective of identifying what the evidence needs were, what the evidence capacities are, and how do we actually meet the SEIAS evidence needs. And I think this is quite critical for all of us evidence champions in the room today, that the purpose was to be supportive to the SEIAS process, noting that there was the SEIAS 1 initial impact assessment, and then the SEIAS 2, the final impact assessment process that was underway. So the second part of the guide is actually the how-to part. Now the how-to part, what we had done was to be able to pilot it over the years, and we're talking about for the past 3-4 years that SEIAS was underway, the SEIAS system was underway, but actually how do we support the evidence capacity needs that we have been identifying over a period of time across the sectors. So the contextual analysis is by far the part that departments can take control over because of the deep historical and the social impact that we are seeking to influence, because no policy actually arises on a blank slate. Then we introduced a pre-SEIAS stage so that departments can become more proactive in the process of policy reviews, rather than looking at it from an urgency point of view, and when a SEIAS or a process of introducing new rules that there is no evidence that we can generate in a quick turnaround time, then actually undertaking the actual SEIAS. So the pre-SEIAS phase is really capacitating the departments to be able to be more responsive as and when the SEIAS process is unfolding. So I think this in a nutshell is navigating the guide, but I want to focus on key aspects of the guide. In terms of principles of social justice, what is meant by evidence management? I think Pulani and Rudy will let you know that the system of impact assessment is being introduced as compared to a single project that we know using impact methodology in its design is what we are familiar with. But this is a little bit more in terms of introducing a system. How the SEIAS and the guide approaches societal impact, a few thoughts on that, and where and how, in terms of just following up on what Pulani has mentioned in terms of locating SEIAS in the center of government, and finally, some thoughts at the end on the next steps. So just to let you, to become aware of the fact that the principles of social justice has been introduced through the SEIAS system, and I was actually quite struck by the SEIAS in its conceptualization on the principle of social justice impacting on broader public, where it says that in a deeply unequal society like South Africa, any policy will have unequal impacts. Now, this was for me by far the biggest area of brainwave, in a way that, we've been measuring societal impact in ways that really equalizes the playing field. And I think this is where we may have to start looking at it in a way that's different. Assessing impact and measured for different social groups has huge implications on evidence generation and its needs, no matter what the context. And I think that for our international colleagues that are in this room today, we note that this may be a South African chapter, but we also know that there are many contexts that are similar in this situation. SEIAS ensures that in assessing impact realistically, the costs and benefits must be measured for different social groups across society for effective comparisons. Now, we found that given all we know of evidence-informed decision-making, when there is no data available on actual beneficiaries, then we have lost the cause for addressing social justice. And this has an implication not just for government and academia, but also for civil society to become a bit more active in this evidence generation. So becoming a strong advocate for relevant generation of administrative data is where I found that the power lies now. And working on these two high-level areas of need in terms of the way impact is measured. So this I hope to be able to give you a little bit more insight on. Some thoughts on embedded evidence engagement. I think in terms of the way Pulani has mentioned, that it's not just about, the way government is bringing out the information and assessing impact, but it's about the different bodies of evidence that is needed through an inclusive process. And this is already contained in the theory of change of SEIAS, and linking the kind of voices that needs to be included goes beyond just academics and government as well. In terms of evidence synthesis, I think Ruth and our ACE colleagues have already noted the huge burden of information overload that we generate on a daily basis, and COVID has just demonstrated that. But the need for curation and organization of these evidence bases behind the scenes in preparation for evidence synthesis, that's a big one. Also, Pulani has mentioned the way capacity at an individual level is not enough if organizations are struggling in terms of processing all this information, and that does not help in the building block towards institutional capacity. For us in the public sector, the building public sector knowledge resources that are combined in this inclusivity is quite a challenge, so that we can become a little bit more effective in public policy making with public knowledge resources as the core to evidence generation. I think for us, this kind of embedded knowledge management process and this embedded evidence management is more of an organizational level capacity that is lacking in a lot of the departments that are struggling to even bring out, not just for SEIAS purposes, but to implement public policy, which we know is such a big challenge. So in terms of the system of assessing impact, I think for me, if this is not the game changer, then I'm not sure what is. If we bring out the fact that the guide outlines the SEIAS in terms of a theory of change and has a related table of evidence needs as it links to the policy cycle that SEIAS has put forward there. But I think that we know many of the evidence champions know and are familiar with these kind of methods. But it's also clear that the evidence community or networks out there has come up with a hierarchy of evidence in terms of systematic reviews, RCTs as the gold standards, which is actually quite critical in its application to reviewing public policy. Yet in the complexity of a changing and dynamic context, as SEIAS is proposing, these sources of evidence will not be generated at the pace, cost, and timelines required. So we find that there are various systems in place which come together or need to come together in their unique contributions to assess impact. And these are the National System of Innovation and Research that is already existing out there, government's own monitoring systems, as well as monitoring systems from citizens and from academia, but also with evaluation systems. So basically, these are systems on their own, but in terms of assessing impact in a more realistic and timely manner, these have to come together. We also have the citizens' feedback from different angles within government, within the presidency itself. We have the presidential hotline, we have citizens-based monitoring, but we also know that civil society plays a key role in this. We also have the political system in understanding why and what policies are taking focus and taking root, rather than in terms of the fact that some of the research agendas are showing maybe in another angle to societal impact, to even achieve societal impact. Then there's the entire government system. So these are various systems that actually SEIAS has to bring a focus on in terms of the way evidence is generated. So if we follow then on from appreciating the systems approach in implementing SEIAS, we find that societal impact is actually through this collaboration. And if we have a collective vision of the desired change from the current status to where we want a change to be effected, it does mean that all these different stakeholders, and remember that in the SEIAS process, the last point here being consultations, that this bargaining work that policy is so known to have, known to be undertaking if there is consensus building that's needed, that it is a collective vision for societal impact in the desired direction that we want it to be. Alignment is key for the SEIAS process, and this is where evidence generation must have the starting point in terms of the 7 national priorities. Pulani had mentioned, the contradictions that we do come across when sector departments are in charge of the different policy processes, that we talk of policy coherence. And here is not just about what a diagnostic research or evaluation has shown, but what in terms of costs to the which is the second point, but costs in terms of the trade-offs and spillovers that need to be interrogated. And the SEIAS methodology does this incredibly deep and intensely for it. So that's the thinking process in terms of the what Pulani has put forward in terms of the thinking process rather than a compliance check. I mentioned the costs, but the costs to government as well as to beneficiaries, which any officials together with their counterparts in terms of those that are generating evidence to actually bring out that level of evidence, which often does lack. In terms of consultations for affected groups as well as across agencies inside and outside of government. And I think this is one of the key roles government has to play, which is to bring the stakeholders together. And it's academics and those that are generating evidence are only part of those stakeholders. That outside of government becomes a lot more in terms of even the unions and even the private sector and business community that brings evidence to the table in their own way. So this for us is where societal impact becomes so much more of a need in terms of more realistically assessing impact than rather just through single projects and studies. So I think this is my last slide in actually locating SEIAS within the center of government. And if you just look at what this aspect of the SEIAS process is expecting many government departments to do, it's quite an important focus to have, because it's not just it's not just asking departments to take heed of this methodology. It's actually if you think about the center of government's role, it's an institution or a group of institutions that actually provide direct support to the country's chief executive. And what's important is the location. I see there were some questions around where SEIAS is actually located versus the functions performed. And the macro structure there is that at least Pulani's team and wherever the location is playing that oversight role, that the oversight role is integration across the sectors, but in terms of the methodology, in terms of the standardization, we see that DPME has a role, the NPC has a role, and even government communications. But these functions of coordination that was mentioned, the strategic planning that is there within DPME, which also moved from Treasury, the coordination in terms of policy design, different from political coordination, is the critical one. And that's where a lot of the performance monitoring teams within DPME and across DPME are also considering the whole impact question on a wider scale. So this is important for us, and to be able to say that where functions are duplicated or where functions needs to be moved across, the center of government is key in developing guidelines, developing methodologies, and being able to institutionalize this process, which is such a milestone to be achieved through the SEIAS. So just in ending then, the next steps for us are two-pronged. We're always talking about building capacity, but I think for us, the equal contender is building content as well. So building capacity, we want to be able to have government officials know when technical skills are needed, where they depend on the wider research community out there with evidence generators. But the actual important aspect of building capacities is for organizational effectiveness across departments to actually engage with this evidence base that is being generated. We're going to come up with the methodology series because many different ways of generating evidence are now being put forward, and you know, the basic primary methods of quantitative, qualitative are not enough, but really synthesis methodologies by far now the bigger demand. But in terms of building content, we see that constructing different evidence bases are the key to being responsive. I'm not sure how it is possible to be responsive to knowledge needs and to generating any rapid reviews are possible without constructing evidence bases. So I mentioned about public sector knowledge systems, and this is department by department. We are in some departments we are hand-holding and providing this support, but in other departments they've already taken off. There's a lot of expertise in the picture. I think overall it's about institutional memory that is quite critical across government. I'm going to stop there then, Chair. Thank you so much for the attention, and
Thank you.
I hand over back to you.
Thank you, Harsha. Thank you for the very informative presentation. Now we're gonna take a presentation from Human Settlement, which demonstrates how these tools have been used in practice. I call upon Ms. Nonhlanhla Buthelezi to come in. She is an acting Deputy Director General at the Department of Human Settlement. She's responsible for policy and research. I actually know her from the technical working group of the social cluster of cabinet, where she is a chairperson. Nonhlanhla heads an area of governance framework portfolio that deals with the empowerment of designated groups, which is women, persons with disability, and youth in that department. She is a candidate PhD student. Amongst the qualifications, a master's degree in social development and social policy from University of Pretoria, and a certificate in economics from University of Norway. Over to you, Em.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, colleagues. I hope I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay, and is my presentation showing on the screen?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great, thank you. I'm just gonna switch on the video just for colleagues to see me, then I'm gonna switch it off so that I can proceed with the presentation. Chairperson, I think the big issue for us is that we've been invited to this forum. It's a community of practice, but we thought it's a good forum that you are hosting. It's a good conversation, but it wouldn't be that good without us maybe sharing with all the members in this forum our journey as human settlements. Like you've indicated, Chair, in the working group of the social cluster, I always make it a point that at least we do talk about whether policies or legislation that are coming there, they have went through the process of SEIAS, and if they are not, that certificate or the report is not there, we make it a point, and as a chair, I make it a point that we advocate for this tool, and we send back some of the departments that will come and not give us what needs to be done in terms of the SEIAS requirements. I think it's safe to share the fact that in the department, our journey commences as far back as 2013, 2014, where the team from DPME approached our executive management committee. It presented the SEIAS process as to where it came from and what needed to be done. And at that time, I think the instrument was still very new. Everybody understood that there is a RIA, and RIA is so critical towards satisfying some of the cabinet requirements, apart from all the other elements of what's legal certification that will come from the state law advisors. At the time, I think also what is key to mention is the fact that Cabinet had returned a lot of policy documents and a lot of legislation back to most sector departments, including ours. And what they had asked us to do was to develop what was called policy foundations. And we were not understanding even this terminology of policy foundation as to what is it that they were referring to. So when Pulane and the team came and introduced it, for me, it became a solution towards most of the problems we were experiencing at the time. Given that I was sitting in policy and heading this policy team, I had to quickly try and align with all these requirements that were coming through and align even the documents that we had to prepare. From that time, I think I became the CS champion, and I've been serving as the champion for a period of more or less 7 years. I know I did try to maybe hand over some of the functions to the colleagues that are there. And as I'm winning off the responsibility, I think for me, it helps to even go further in terms of capacity building for everybody. I've just in this slide selected a few of the policy documents that we've drafted as a Department of Human Settlements, and a majority of them, I think it's based on the ones where I think we ran into what challenges around what needed to be done. And it became more easier as time went on because the tool had already been institutionalized. And our institutionalization occurred at different levels. It was at a executive management level. It was also at branch levels, given that we have about 6 branches. And immediately when you say you've got a tool that needs to be used, everybody tends to push back and think that you are coming up with things which are not understood. So part of me reflecting all these documents, it's around highlighting the fact that we have used it extensively. This list is not exhaustive, but it's those examples that could come up in my mind as I was putting together the presentation. I think one of the critical ones amongst all these ones, which I think it has helped us as a sector, including some of the Chapter 9 institutions in terms of what we're expected to develop, it's that policy on special housing needs. A policy on special housing needs is one of those instruments which became more of an issue for the department, given that it involved a number of other sector departments like the Department of Social Development, Department of Health, and Department of Correctional Services. And the pressure was more around saying, you as Department of Human Settlements, you need to come up with a policy that addresses the issue of special housing needs, but we couldn't do that on our own because we required other sector departments to come on board. And then we found ourselves in a situation where there were a lot of orders issued by the South African Human Rights Commission, the Commission on Gender Equality, and everybody was not understanding as to why are we not finalizing this policy instrument, because everyone thought it was an easy one. And we had to come in, bring the team from DPME and the presidency just for everybody to understand what needed to be done. But I must say, based on that experience, it sort of brought on board information to the attention of other role players who are outside government, like your NGOs, who were advocating for this instrument. And based on that experience, I think I'm happy to be making some of the recommendations, which I'm gonna get to. But as you were introducing me, Chair, or asking the questions, saying you will be going back to Pulana, I was laughing and saying, with us, I think we've done COVID relief interventions. There are two, actually there are three. One it's on rent relief, another one it's on debt relief, and another one it's on contractor relief. We had to force everyone to go through the very same process so that we can be able to safely say the problem that we are resolving, is it the real problem, or it's just a root cause, or it's something else which does not necessarily require a policy. So I'm happy to say that in our experience or in our environment, we've made sure that we even subject the COVID interventions through the SEIAS instrument, and it has helped a great deal because we are able to look at the risk that goes with the intervention or the policy that we are coming up with. We are able to look at the benefits in terms of what we are proposing. We are also able to look at the implications in terms of cost bearers and what it means for the sector to be able to provide that specific service. I think there's a lot that is happening in our space. I always say human settlements, it's very broad. You've seen a lot of things happening on national or in the public domain around the issues of land policy, around the issues of de-densification. I've brought it to an extent that as a champion, I even say when we are developing strategies, like when we came with de-densification, let us try and apply the tools so that we really realize what is the nature of the problem that we are dealing with and the kind of instrument or solution that we are proposing, whether it's the correct one. So I've just given you this list. It's just for you to see as colleagues, but I think it's not an exhaustive list like I indicated. Like I highlighted our journey, I think it started, I think Pulani and Harsha did talk about the SEIAS phase 1, and we spoke about the SEIAS phase 2. I know I'm still stuck in terms of the old terminology because I'm one of those people who started with the process in the early days. And the best way of explaining it to everyone who is not that much of an expert in terms of it, I always use the phases so that it doesn't become confusing. And I've highlighted the fact that there has to be a clear understanding of the tool. And at the time when we started, that lack of understanding was not there. So as a department and as what maybe the champion with the whole branch and the chief directorates, including the directorates that deals with macro policy, we had to play an advocacy role to the department and also to our entities. I think we've got about 6 entities And over and above that, I think I'm not reflecting in terms of what we did with the provinces, because as I'm saying, we've even brought on board the NGOs who were a part of the policy on special housing needs. There is a component that we had to deal with, which pertain to what maybe provinces and also other sector departments, which had to be part of this process. Our role also, Chair, became a role of guiding the process, taking colleagues through the questionnaire, explaining what the expectation is. And I must admit, Chair and colleagues, sometimes educating colleagues about an instrument, when you are within, to a certain extent, there are those who say, where are these ones coming from? Why now they are subjecting us to all this? We think we are fine, we understand. And the support that we often get from the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, it's around enforcing what we would have explained, because you'll guide the process as we play the guiding role. But to a certain extent, there'll be those other areas which colleagues, they think they can just get away without giving a detailed explanation. And for us, it's more around explaining what needs to be done. I've already spoken to the fact that I chair the technical working group of the social cluster. We do a quality check with the rest of the committee members in terms of the work of all submissions that are going to cabinet. And if there's no report or indication on whether SEIAS has been done, the questionnaire being attached or the certificate being signed off, we do return that sector department back. And the key issue, I think, it's the fact that there are benefits. And once you know what the instrument is all about, I think for me and my department, it has become even a very useful tool in terms of crafting the briefing notes. Oftentimes you'll have a particular instrument or policy or legislation going to cabinet, but you are being asked to prepare briefing notes. As you are asked to prepare briefing notes, you think of just extracting from the policy or the legislation, and it becomes maybe a very high-level document. And if you pull from the SEIAS questionnaire, it tends to give you what the actual problem is, what are the root causes, and what the solution is. So for me and for the colleagues in the forum, I would say it has what may be good benefits for everybody, because you can, within a short period of time, extract from the very same SEIAS report, because oftentimes when we go to cabinet, you'll just attach a certificate, but no one will see the SEIAS report unless that person gets directed to go to the website and read the entire SEIAS report. So if you are packaging briefing notes for our principals, I would recommend that it works faster, because you would have refined your report. You'll know where what the benefits are of a particular policy that or legislation or instrument that you're taking to cabinet. And within 30 minutes, you'll be having a brief notes which helps you to explain the instrument that you're taking to cabinet to our executive. And I think I thought also it's critical to mention this part. I know Hasha spoke about it in terms of the evidence map. From our experience, or my experience within human settlement, is that the SEIAS process is there. You'll read, you'll package the SEIAS reports, but without detailed information emanating from the research reports, it becomes a little bit difficult to go into a background around certain aspects of what the actual problem is and what the recommendations are without you going through those research reports. The other documents which also assist is the evaluation reports. I think given that it's being driven from the office where the team is sitting, it becomes easy because you pull from the website, you're able to refer to the detail in terms of what were the issues and what is it that is being recommended for a specific intervention. So with my department, I think we've had about more than 7 evaluations that have been done. So with the majority of the documents that I've made reference to, I think the evaluations came in handy in terms of us packaging the SEIAS report. The other documents which have been useful, it's reports that are what we regard them as expenditure review reports. They are driven from the National Treasury. I know they are also institutionalizing them, saying let the sector departments take responsibility for conducting them, because we need all of us to understand how to deal with expenditure review and be able to see the value around it. So those three reports, they become very useful in terms of us what maybe engaging around what goes into the report. The other areas which have assisted as well in the department is that we have what we call a policy task team. And the policy task team will have all what heads of policy who are sitting in the 9 provincial departments, in the 8 metros, these Chapter 9 institutions, and our 6 entities. So the more you consult about a specific policy, by the time you say you're preparing the final SEIAS report, everyone is on board in terms of understanding what we are saying and what we think is the solution. I must say, colleagues, there are those areas where you'll get an instruction to say this is the instrument that you require and you have to develop it. But if you've went through the SEIAS process, you will be able to tell that the solution that is being recommended for a specific problem, it's not the right solution. You are able to package that report, you take it back, but it would not happen without that extensive consultation. And like I say, in our department, we are using the policy task team. When I normally realize that there are so many pitfalls, what I normally do is to ask the team to circulate the SEIAS questionnaire and ask all the provincial departments to populate it and bring it back to us so that they will be able to see on their own without us over explaining ourselves around whether what we are being asked to do is the correct instrument or not. The other thing which has made it easy for us, it's using the panel of experts. In the department, we have what we call POLET. POLET, I think it's an acronym for Policy and Legal Experts. It's a team of people who are sitting externally. They've been in the sector. Some they work in the legal environment. Some they are more into implementation, but it's people who fully understand the human settlement space. And when we populate it, we often say, let's have an independent report, SEIAS reports that will come from the POLET group, which will look at and consolidate it with our thinking, either coming from the sector department, coming from the provincial departments, or coming from our own information that we would have populated in the SEIAS questionnaire. Yes.
Yeah, I think move a little bit quicker because the time for other speakers.
I'm almost there, Jay. The other one, it's around developing what we call a value chain for each and every document, because that's how you realize that there are other areas that you would not have looked at. I'm not gonna go through this one, but I think I was just trying to highlight the examples in terms of the policy documents that we would have went through, trying to portray where the problems are and what we need to do. So my recommendations, Chair, it's only 2 areas which are basically around capacity building. And I'm saying more capacity building, more capacity building. I don't know how many times I want to repeat it, but it has to occur at different levels. It's at a societal level. I've given you the NGO example, at an organizational level, as well as a political and institutional level. My second recommendation is that we should have a module within our curriculum, especially where policy development or social policy is being taught. I became a little bit selfish, Chair, and said in my department, we have what we call a degree on human settlement, so that could be made to be a starting point. But thank you very much for indulging with me. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
And it's a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for presenting for us this afternoon. And I'm sorry that we don't have more time to hear about the exciting work in human settlements. I'm even more sorry that we don't get to share a platform in person and catch up. Unfortunately, these sessions always have an element of impersonality. But thank you so much. I'm going to introduce our next respondent, who is Julian May, and I'm hoping, Julian, that you can pop your presentation up while I introduce you. As an academic, I do research not because I want to publish papers or even be a professor, but because I want to make a difference. And our next speaker, Julian May, is really inspiring because I believe he shares the same drive. He's a researcher on a number of different important areas around food and nutrition, and a very eminent professor with a number of important roles and expert advice roles to many different UN agencies. But perhaps the most important thing is that he wants to make a difference to child malnutrition through his research. So it's really my pleasure to hand over to Julian May to speak a little bit about from a research perspective about how we can make a societal impact and respond to what we've been hearing about SEIAS and the evidence guide. Julian, over to you.
Thank you. I hope everyone can see my screen.
We can, thank you.
Great. All right, so I'm going to take off from Leclanque's slide where she said bringing in the universities. I'm the director of a Center of Excellence in Food Security, the DSI NRF Center of Excellence. We are funded by the Department of Science and Innovation and the National Research Foundation, hosted at the University of the Western Cape and co-hosted at the University of Pretoria. Centers of Excellence have a quite particular role to play in South Africa. Our program officer is very fond of saying that he knows that researchers know how to ride the bicycle, that we know how to do research and to graduate students, but where is the bicycle going? And so a lot of the emphasis of these centers of excellence is how to achieve societal impact through the research that we do. I'm going to talk about one particular project, and that is one that we've just recently finished on child malnutrition. And what I'm going to be speaking about is how do you create the demand for this important topic when there are so many other things that government is concerned about. Sorry, just trying to get my slide to move there. Okay, this research project was prompted by what we thought of as a food security paradox. In South Africa, we have more than enough food at the national level, so we produce the food that we need, both the calories and the micronutrients. We have a declining child hunger. This is the hunger that parents report their children experience. We have Africa's most comprehensive social protection program for children, free primary healthcare, vitamin A supplementation, and we're a leader in the research that's needed to be able to make a difference for children. However, we have unchanged child stunting for over 2 decades. Child stunting is a sign of chronic malnutrition. It's something that really should have changed in South Africa, particularly when we consider that similar policies elsewhere in the world have produced significant change, such as Brazil or in Peru. It's a particular kind of problem, and this is the kind of problem that fascinates academics. At one term for it is a wicked problem. It doesn't have a solution. It has a continuum of good to bad solutions. It's very hard to test whether your solution is durable or whether it's a good solution. There's no set of permissible options. Many things can be tried. However, your problem might be potentially unique to a particular area or to a particular family. Importantly, the problem may be a symptom of other problems. And when you're thinking about evidence and how to use evidence, the concern of a wicked problem is that there may be multiple explanations of the problem. It depends where you are and what you think are the critical issues as to how you define what the problem is and thus what the solution is. When you try and solve a wicked problem, it counts, even if you get it wrong. Often people like myself, perhaps people like others in the audience, aspirant solvers of the problem, really should be culpable for our solutions. We can cause things to be worse. Finally, time is running out, and this is important with child malnutrition, and those who are causing the problem may be also those who are trying to provide the solution. And lastly, of critical importance for anything to do with food security, the absence of a central authority. There's no one government department that is responsible for food security in South Africa, though we have made progress in that respect. So in trying to do this, we undertook a research project that started in 2016 and ran until 2019. It gathered new evidence on the causes of child malnutrition, new ideas about ways in which we can solve it, looking at international experience, new options for government to act. And having compiled that information, we needed to think about, as researchers, how do we bring it to the attention of people such as are in this room? So yes, we also need to think about a theory of change as non-government champions of evidence. How do we try and induce change by bringing our research to you in a way that causes you to sit up and take notice? So the first in our theory of change was a pathway to influence. How do we get noticed? In this particular study, which I will talk about where you can obtain it, we use the term slow violence. We used it we drew this term from climate change activists and applied it to the situation of children. In other words, by slow violence, we mean a violence that occurs gradually and often out of sight, of delayed destruction. The impact of child malnutrition usually is only noticed in adulthood. It's dispersed across time and space, and it's an attritional violence. It's often not viewed as violence at all, to think about the fact that we have hungry children in South Africa. Then we needed to think about, as the second stage of our pathway to impact, what are the opportunities that exist for impact? So on the left, these are the kinds of standard spaces in which we can influence the development of a child. Preconception, so we can improve the health of women that are going to be mothers, of particularly adolescent girls. The prenatal period, when the child is still in the womb, is one of the most critical stages of human development for that child. Then there's the first postnatal week, an absolutely critical week when mothers start doing things like exclusive breastfeeding, and they start learning how to care for a newborn. The neonatal period, the childhood period, pubertal period, the pubertal periods, all of these are points where we can intervene. And each time it's a continuous cycle. By the time the child has become an adolescent, we need to start preparing that adolescent and making sure that she is healthy so that she can raise children. So those are the opportunities for impact. As you can see, there are many, and there were many policy options that we could have proposed in our study. But we decided to focus on three simple messages: increase the child support grant, establish the National Food and Nutrition Council in the format that was envisaged by the policy, and provide a roadmap to achieving Section 28(1)(c) and Section 28(1)(d) of our Constitution. In other words, this particular proposal was not to introduce new policy, but rather to implement the policies that they are and to expand their coverage. The second thing that we tried to do in developing a way of influencing policy was to propose a whole of society model. In other words, not simply to say to government, you are responsible for delivery, but to recognize that there are many actors involved in the delivery of health for children. Government certainly, and different spheres of government, definitely, whether provincial, national, or municipal, but also the role of NGOs, the role of the private sector as the key supplier of food, and the role of universities themselves, how we as university-based researchers can better assist in developing evidence, testing evidence, and creating new knowledge. So the approach was not an approach that said, government, please do this. It was an approach that said, society must take responsibility, and here are the roles that could be assigned to different actors in society. The next was to find a trusted partner. And not only a partner that was trusted, but a partner who adopted processes which are also trusted. In trying to get this research noticed, we approached the South African Child Gauge, which is an annual report produced by the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town. It has been produced for nearly 20 years and is well regarded both by government officials in different departments, as well as by international organizations such as UNICEF and, of course, the NGO sector. The Children's Institute were willing to take on this task, and in 2020 they asked myself, a colleague at the University of Free State, Chantal Witten, and the lead researcher at the Children's Institute, Laurie Lake, to take on the task of editing this document. It's a free document. It is has multiple chapters that take us through the life course of a child, explaining at each stage what does the evidence show us and what can be done. And we produce a simple policy brief there that reminds us of the message: the slow violence of malnutrition against children. We tried to develop pragmatic solutions. And in this instance, we went to existing policies and tried to examine how those policies could be sharpened, both in terms of being better implemented, but more importantly, being better coordinated. One of the key research findings was that although we have policies, and although the policies are making impact, they are not well coordinated, and as a result, often are not achieving the impact that we would desire when we try and bring them together. Partly this is because the policies are at different spheres of government, partially because they are in different departments of government, and partially because it's not only government that needs to be doing something. At the bottom there, you'll see a conversation on double duty actions. This is taken from international evidence from the WHO, which focus on the idea of actions that can do multiple purposes. We adopted a process of continuous science communication driven by a champion. In our instance, the champion was the First Lady of South Africa, who opened the conference and who opened our workshop and presented the report. She spoke eloquently against the need to do something about the slow violence against our children. We also engaged in advocacy. We have engaged in meetings where we try to present to the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, the technical subcommittee. We included young activists. Down the bottom in the corner there is an equalizer from Equal Education who spoke about the important work that they were doing in promoting child malnutrition, in promoting action against child malnutrition in schools. So our science communication was at different levels with different champions and focusing on different ways in which we could engage with society and with government to bring attention to what we were trying to achieve. I'm nearly finished, Chair. The last two slides. One thing I did want to reflect on, and because this workshop was co-hosted by a university organization, is just to remind those who might not realize that there are implications for non-government evidence champions. We need to have the intention to influence from the outset. It's not good enough to do research and then decide now you need to try and influence. You need to find the means to influence, to take advantage of opportunities to do so. There are costs to playing this role. Universities traditionally recognize the graduation of students and the publication of papers in academic journals. Doing this kind of work is not usually recognized by universities. And so there's a cost that you have to deal with. Recognizing that those who you're trying to influence have many things on their plate, and what is the absorptive capacity? What is the ability to be able to be influenced? Their willingness, the ability to influence others in power. And finally, the extent to which that influence can endure into implementation. We need to think about how do we attribute what change we might have achieved by doing these kinds of exercises. Very rarely will a government say, we decided to do this intervention because Professor May or Professor Stewart recommended that we do it. So we have to take cognizance that our work is not necessarily going to be referenced, to believe that it matters, and finally to identify next steps. And so, Chair, let me leave you with the next steps. We released the child gauge as a report and as a policy brief back on the 8th of April. The next steps that we've been asking ourselves is what more can be done? What do we do, particularly about mitigating the rise of poverty and hunger that we know has taken place during COVID-19? So through the Academy of Science in South Africa, ASIF, for which I'm a council member, we have introduced a new webinar series. Again, 3 simple questions. What should we do? This took place in May. It was co-hosted by SPI. Key thing, when we're talking to government, how are we going to pay for this? This webinar, which you're invited to, takes place on the 10th of June. It will be co-hosted by the Bureau of Economic Research at the University of Stellenbosch. And lastly, and I noted this in Lachlanka's presentation, how can we be capable of implementing the changes that we're trying to introduce, recognizing that the capabilities, capacity that was raised several times by Lachlanka is taken care of. And that will take place on the 10th of July, and that will be co-hosted by the SACHA Chair in Social Policy at UNISA. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you very much, Prof. May. I just want to alert the colleagues. There are some questions that have been asked on the Q&A box. I noticed that Harsha is already responding to some of those. I will highlight some of them, the questions that were asked. The question that what is the role of the non-governmental actors in supporting the management and use of evidence for the SEIAS? I think that's the question for Pulane. And then the next question for Pulane is whether the evidence used is gender sensitive. And also that what is the assessment now? Are we getting positive outcomes following the use of or the adoption of the use of SEIAS? What is your assessment? I'm posing these questions for Pulane. If you may come in and respond. I also invite hands. For those that want to ask questions, you can indicate by raising a hand. Or any of the speakers, if you want to respond to the questions, please do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for the question. The external stakeholders, NGOs, private sector, academia, the public in general are very critical in the SEIAS process, but also in policy making. The Constitution is very clear that the public has to be engaged in policy development. So they are critical because also the problems or opportunities that government intends to address impact people differently, and therefore engagement is very critical. You cannot expect an official sitting in his or her own corner deciding a policy for the country. So it's very important to engage with various stakeholders. It's also part of buy-in. It's part of creating awareness, but it's also part of gaining further evidence in terms of the policy proposals that have to be processed. Then the other part that we have put, we have the public policies development and research network that comprise of government, academia, NGOs to also strengthen the evidence that we have as government that support policy making processes. So our SEIAS templates also have sections that kind of assist departments in terms of the type of stakeholders that needs to be engaged with regard to their policy proposal. So for example, phase one wants to know the socio-economic problem that needs to be addressed and the different groups of the society that are being affected by that particular problem. So it already kind of categorize the type of stakeholders that needs to be engaged. But it's also important also that we engage even those groups of society that are going to benefit from your proposal so that they are aware of services that needs to be rendered through that particular policy proposal that is going to be initiated by department. So it's very important. There was a particular strategy that was done by PICAS in the anti-poverty strategy. So it was saying one of the challenges that our communities are unable to access the services that are offered by government is because they are not aware or they do not know. So it's very important to say those who are also going to benefit from a particular policy have to be engaged so that they have the details on the implementation of such policy proposal. So it's very important. So in our SEIAS, we also ask, for example, whether a department has engaged external stakeholders and what are their views? Are they in support of your policy proposal or not? And what risks and costs do they see or anticipate through your policy? So if your report indicate a lot of maybe disputes or concerns from stakeholders, we also facilitate and invite the affected stakeholders so that we are able to address those issues, but also to improve that particular policy. So it's very critical that we engage with our stakeholders. Sorry, Chair, the other question that you asked.
The other question that I asked was that whether in your assessment, are we getting positive outcomes following the use of SEIAS as far as you're concerned?
Oh, okay. Thank you for the question. There are some of the benefits of using SEIAS, but we are planning to have a comprehensive evaluation of SEIAS in terms of the impact that it has made since 2015. But we also need to understand the cycle of lawmaking. Hence, I indicated in one of the interventions that we need to reduce the turnaround time to finalize legislation. So imagine if it takes 5 years for a bill that went through SEIAS to be finalized and another 2 years for its implementation, then we are not able to measure whether that particular legislation that went through SEIAS and being implemented is making the impact that was done through in early stages of that. So we are currently putting resources to do an entire evaluation on whether SEIAS has done some impact, but there are some noticeable areas, for example, where SEIAS will indicate that to a department that there's no need to come up with a new policy or legislation, you just have to improve what is existing. So we have those kind of decisions. We have decisions where SEIAS facilitate to say maybe this particular pathway should not be pursued because there are no resources, or put into phased approach of a particular policy. But we have seen also through SEIAS where we had pulled resources from other departments to support an implementation of a particular policy, and therefore reducing the cost to the public. So those are some of the early findings around the impact that it does and assist. So so we're going to do a proper evaluation so that we're able to publicly share those findings. Thank you, Chair.
Lani, that was, you anticipated the question that I had highlighted from the Q&A as being particularly important. So I think I am joining others in being really excited to hear about this evaluation and looking forward to hearing the results, even though we recognize that it will take a while. I'm passing the microphone back to my colleague Godfrey to introduce our closing speaker, Rudy Dix. Thank you.
Please go ahead, Prof.
Thank you. So I have to apologize to those of you who've been pitching questions that we don't have time to take more, and perhaps we should think of a discussion forum to pick up on some of these interesting issues at a later date. It's my pleasure now to introduce Rudy Dix, our last speaker, who will be closing for us today. Rudy is head of the Project Management Office in the Private Office of the President, and I think many of us consider him to be largely responsible for many of the elements of the SEIAS system, and a lot of what we've heard today has been because of his vision and drive. So without further ado, I'm going to pass across to Rudy and welcome you to this forum this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth. It was always good to be back again in, engaging on issues when I started way back with Polani in 2015. Just a side note. I mean, when we started this thing in 2015, I was alone, and we were trying to think, how are we going to implement this thing where there's a lot of resistance to impact assessments and many departments not wanting the center of government to question them about particular sets of legislation or policies or regulations. And I recall a conversation I had with our former Director General in the presidency, Dr. Cassius Lubisi, and after presenting it to the Forum for South African Director Generals, successfully so, by the way, where they had endorsed it. Very difficult questions, of course, much similar to what has been asked in the chat groups around, what's the difference between RIA? Why RIA? The thing worked. Didn't it work? Why is it not working? Why are we doing something new? We're always doing something different. We don't give it enough chance to, and his side conversation with me, Rudy, you're going to be very gray at the end of this. You're going to be fighting with the entire government system. I still got all my hair. I'm a little bit grayer, but certainly I think that was a telling message, because this is a difficult thing to do when you introduce something of a different system that tries, as Polani and Harsha has reflected, and some of the examples that have been shown by Nhlanhla, and of course Julian's important input also. The bedrock of the SEIAS system, I mean, I think Godfrey's point at the beginning was two things. When we introduced this thing, there was two critical things that we wanted. We didn't want them, so when you talk about one of the systematic changes that we did around impact assessments and why the SEIAS system, was that historically you had evidence that's been done, and as soon as the evidence provided knowledge against a particular set of legislation or policy, you would find officials or even ministers shelving that document. So evidence suddenly became a no issue, suddenly became a matter where, no, we're not going to show, and I'm not going to cite some of the examples of departments who have done that, but I know of examples of departments who have done that, who when we asked for the RIA report, and they said, no, it's not for sharing, it's confidential. So I think it's important that in establishing the SEIAS system, what we did as one of its bedrock was evidence is going to be an important system. And this is what motivated Cabinet to take this decision, the Director Generals to support it, that evidence and knowledge is going to be quite a critical thing in the broader spectrum of a developmental state. Because the developmental state context was important, and this distinguished that from what the RIA was. The second most important thing, and I thought that many colleagues have asked questions particularly, was that we wanted to develop a partnership with academia, with civil society, with business, with unions, around understanding why we want them to understand and accept a new system of impact assessment. Because it's about understanding the decisions that you make. And generally, I mean, Polani's point about officials sitting in a corner and designing something, I mean, we still have that today, right? Cannabis legislation, for example, I've been told that there's one guy who sits in the corner there, it's his, you can't mess with it. And this is the point about developing an open system as SEIAS has been designed, was partly to ensure that there's an open and robust engagement. So, of course, the point about impact assessment is that not everybody's going to agree with you. You're not necessarily going to get agreements on many of the things that you will wish to achieve in a policy document or in a piece of legislation. And there are different interest groups at stake here. And that's why it's important that in the socio-economic impact assessment, we must be able to understand what the legislation or changes in policy have on different groups. And because we are a developmental state, there is an overt biasness towards this kind of different groupings, small businesses, younger people, women, workers, for instance. Because if we're trying to build a just and equal society, it's important that we look at it in a manner that reflects on our developmental objectives. So not to shelve it, not to say where there are specific sets of regulations and evidence shows that no, you shouldn't do that, that we then adopt a very rigorous approach that says, okay, because evidence says, no, you shouldn't adopt it, that we don't do it. Labor legislation is a classical example of that. You know, labor legislation, for example, again, some of the interesting RIA reports that were there, you would ask, you know, so if we provide, you know, an impact assessment and we do a regulatory impact report on a particular sets of legislation, let's just say changes to the Labor Relations Act, of course, it's going to have a cost to society. It's a cost to business. But in the longer run, the developmental objectives of creating a just and equal society and a labor dispensation that protects workers and employers are quite important, given the historical significance of where we come from. So it is going to have an overt biasness. But it doesn't necessarily say that we're going to shaft the regulatory changes. What we need to understand is the cost of that impact and whether we are able to mitigate against that cost of that impact. And I think that's fundamentally where we get to. So bedrock, two bedrocks I thought, which is important, you know, partnerships and engaging upfront with different sectors of society and understanding what our objectives are, not hiding it away. And secondly, evidence-based, because that's important. We can't just take decisions on a political whim. We can't just take a decision because that minister likes that, you know, or this DDG or DG likes that. It's about evidence. It's about saying, yes, the evidence is important. It supports a developmental objective. There's a cost to society. Who bears that cost? And how do we mitigate against that particular cost if that's the thing? So I thought that's an important. And I mean, I like Pulani's point about the evolution of SEIAS, you know. I mean, again, ideally what we set out was not to develop a compliant tool. And that's why it was fundamentally different in the way. We didn't want a tick box exercise, you know, and we always argued that, you know, and of course, you know, in the 608 that she's done, she will tell you in a lot of cases, when you look at those SEIAS reports when I was still around, it's tick box. They just fill in to comply. But in essence, what we wanted them is to spend a lot of time in understanding why you're making this decision, not that decision. And how is it that you're measuring the cost? Or what is the cost? And who benefits from this? And what other evidence have you looked at? Have you looked at evidence that has been brought from different organizations or entities that have? So I think it's quite important that evidence is critical to us. I mean, this is the one thing. But you know, and I want to remind colleagues that when we set out this, we didn't want to complicate and create a complex system of SEIAS where in a regulatory impact assessment, you have these lengthy, bulky reports. Now, evidence is quite important, but you don't have time to read 150 pages of someone who has some consultant that has come in and has done a really nice, glossy impact assessment of labor relations changes and the impact that it would have on South African society and workers and on business. And, I think it's important that evidence is driven by the nature of the change in the regulation or the policy. So, you know, the more complex the policy or legislation, the more complex the socio-economic impact system would be. And the more complex it would be in terms of evidence and knowledge that would have to be managed in relation to what comes out of that impact study. So I think it's quite important. It's rather driven by the complexity. So if you have a small tweak or change, in some instances, there's been many of that, it doesn't require significant amount of evidence, although evidence is important. And then you lead to something complex. Now, let me give you another example that when I left Pulani and them, was around changes in tobacco legislation. Now, of course, as you know, strong lobby group, you know, lots of people doing research, the tobacco industry pulling out lots and lots of research. So it's important to understand that, you know, this is another dynamic, and I think Harsha talks about it and you know, infers about the fact that there's always a sense of biasness in the evidence that you want to present when you provide a socio-economic impact assessment report, and it wants to support what you want to achieve at the end of the day. And that's a difficult thing to try and get out of the individuals who have been designing particular sets of policy or legislation around the biasness, and to have an open mind that there are actually other forms or other kinds of interventions that may achieve the same objective, but slightly put differently. And so evidence becomes, again, one of those important things that shows in actual fact you can do it in this particular way or that particular way. We use the tobacco legislation, there's only one way. It's bad, a significant impact on the health system, high risk for workers who are in plantations and work on tobacco fields, and of course, a burden public health system where the state, in actual fact, would have to subsidize tobacco companies for, for selling tobacco product. What's the choice? There's not much choices there that we have to do. Unlike wine, for example, there are some benefits, as the health professionals will tell us. There is absolutely no health benefit for smoking cigarettes. And I'm sorry that I'm using this as an example, but this is one of the nasty ones that we have to contend with. So I think it's just in closing, I think it's I think this is an important area of work that I'm so excited about. We've taken it to a different level. We've institutionalized the mechanism. We have to build the evidence and knowledge base of our SEIAS. It's not about complexity. It's not about complex evidence and writing nice, long, fancy reports. It's about understanding your objective and understanding whether we've been able to generate that kind of knowledge. And SEIAS and the knowledge that we generate depends on the complexity of the policy change or the legislative change that's required. And I think it's important that we keep that balance and that simplicity in the way that we design this relative to what was there, which was the regulatory impact assessment. And I think it's quite critical that it provides. Just one last thing before I just say one more other sentence about closing. I mean, the unintended consequences, or perhaps the intended consequences, I really don't know. I figured out much later on in the years that perhaps what this has done and what Phulani has continued to do after I'd left was that the SEIAS has provided an instance of policy coordination across government. So for instance, where there are particular sets of policy that needs to be developed, let's talk about hemp and cannabis. There's a functionality across government around how one deals with hemp and cannabis, from justice to police, to agricultural development, to health. And the SEIAS system allows for that policy coordination in a manner that looks at the impact from a health perspective, to an industrial policy, DTIC also, industrial policy perspective, to the development of the plant and the substance of that, to regulation around narcotics, for example, and our international obligations around narcotics, for example. And that's an interesting thing that we kind of like didn't think about it in the beginning, but as we did this, it allowed us to be able to bring together the complexities in policy development across different departments, and that became much more interesting as well in dealing with some of these things. So I'm really excited that you guys have put this together, Phulani, Harsha, and the team from ACE, Ruth. I'm absolutely excited that we see the kind of partnership. Colleagues will know that I build the work that we do on partnerships with different aspects of society, from academia to civil society, to business, to labor unions, research. And I'm really, really grateful that we've taken this to a different level. And thank everybody for participating in this webinar, and for many of the speakers that are here for giving their time. And of course, thanks to Phulani and the team. The SEIAS team continues to steam on and do the excellent work that they're doing with the support of Harsha, DPME, and Godri, of course. Thank you so much for attending, and thanks for this important event.
Thank you very much, Rudy, for your closing comments. It's really exciting to hear how evidence systems and policy systems come together with partnership. So thank you, colleagues. Thank you for your time, and I wish you well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Nonhlanhla, Rudy.
Thanks.
Yes. We're off to another meeting now, so I'm going to be going off. Thanks, people.